Hey guys! So in today's video, I'm going to be working on something I've been trying to get around to for a little while now, and that is the first video on a series of videos I'm going to be doing on color. Today's video is really more of an introduction to the color wheel than anything else, but in later videos I will be getting more into vocabulary and color theory and things like that as well. So starting off today's video, I have a piece of watercolor paper that I have created two circles on, and I did this by tracing objects I found around my house. I used our cat's food bowl and the lid of a mason jar, so nothing too fancy. You're going to need watercolors in red, blue, and yellow. I'm using a bright red, a cadmium lemon yellow, and a phthalo blue, or however you say that. And of course you can use other types of primary colors, and I will actually do a version of that later on, but you may get different results. And in the second example I actually don't even get a good purple because the red is more of an orange. And that gets a little more into color mixing, and I'll discuss more about that later in this series. So the way that we're going to do our color wheel is we're going to start by setting up two sections of color, about a third of the way around. So they should be in a triangular pattern, our three primary colors, blue, yellow, and red. And then I'm going to slowly blend them into each other in the space in between. I'm starting with orange just because that is the way that I ended up putting the pigments down, but you don't even have to put red and yellow in the same spots if you do not want to. You can switch them around as well, and it will have no impact on the way the actual color wheel turns out. And this process is something that may actually take a little bit of practice. I've definitely messed up a color wheel or two in my time, but I do recommend creating your own color wheel if at all possible, especially if you are a watercolor artist or even an acrylic artist, just because it gives you a good gauge of what your colors specifically look like when they're mixed. There are many uses for color wheels besides being able to pick color palettes. And one of these is simply having a mixing reference. I've actually created a separate mixing reference for my own colors of watercolor, but something that is very simple like this can definitely help you in that process. And as you can see, I'm basically doing the same thing all the way around the circle, slowly mixing the colors into each other and letting them bleed and run. And you may mess up, and I've actually managed to blot up some of the color in some of my attempts in order to place more watercolor that is mixed more thoroughly on top of it. However, a tip that I have found is that keeping your mixture extremely wet is incredibly helpful when it comes to getting this technique down. Something else I also tried to do a little bit in this color wheel is blend the colors in between the secondary and primary colors. And again, this is getting a little bit into color theory terms, but essentially the colors I'm talking about are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. In between those colors on your color wheel, there are blends of the colors. So as your orange bleeds into your yellow, it becomes a little more of an orangey yellow, or as your yellow bleeds into your green, it becomes more of a lime green or a yellow green. If at all possible, I would recommend letting your colors do that, because it does help when it comes to creating color palettes that are a little more complex than just the basic colors. And again, this is a concept I will go into a little bit later in this series on color. I'm using a heat tool to dry this color wheel. You can let it naturally dry or whatever you would like. I was getting a little bit worried that the colors were all going to blend into each other if I let it air dry, so I ended up artificially drying it a little bit. The textures will definitely be a little bit different when you heat dry something as opposed to air drying it. As you can see in the upper right hand corner of this color wheel, where the purple has dried extremely dark and almost splotchy. Personally, I don't mind, but if that is something that bothers you, I would recommend letting it air dry. And now that the color wheel is finished and thoroughly dried, I recommend writing the colors of the watercolors that you're using in the corner of your color wheel. And this is really only for mixing purposes. It lets you know what colors you've used in order to create the tones that you did. Something else to note is that I am using a kind of inexpensive watercolor paper here. This is Canson watercolor paper, but I have used more expensive watercolor papers before, and I will probably be using several of my color wheels interchangeably throughout this series. So if you have different sets of primary colors, as I am showing here in the second part of this video, then you can create new color wheels with those as well. And feel more than welcome to use cheaper watercolor paper if you have it available, simply because this is not meant to be a fancy, intricate painting as much as it is a reference. Now, as you can see on this second example of a color wheel that I'm doing, the red is almost an orangey red. Now, what we know about red and yellow from our most basic elementary idea of color is that when you mix red and yellow, you get orange. Well, because this red is kind of an orangey red, when I mix that with blue, I'm technically mixing red, yellow, and blue instead of just red and blue to create purple. And that is why some combinations of colors will not create a good purple. Where there should be a purple here, I really end up with something that is more of a brown, and that is to be expected from the combination of colors. I try to lighten it up a little bit in the center of the wheel, and this is something you can do if your colors get a little bit muddied for some reason. I have a color wheel in which my yellow, my pure yellow, has turned a little bit green, and I have just painted a yellow swatch on the inside of the color wheel, and this just creates a better, purer color. So that is another thing you can do if your color wheel, for some reason, doesn't work out the way that you expect it to. And in case you're curious about the other colors that I'm using in this color wheel, I am using a cadmium red light in combination with yellow ochre and a color called blue sennelier, and I'm sure I mispronounced that, but it is the brand of the watercolor that I'm using, so I think it's more of a brand specific color as opposed to a typical watercolor. So I hope these tips on creating your own color wheel with the colors you have accessible to you was somewhat helpful, and I would recommend trying this out at least once before we get into color theory in future videos, especially if you do not already have a color wheel of your own. I have the color wheel memorized, I have for years, but I still find myself referring to it because sometimes it is nice to have a visual representation of what you're dealing with. Before I go today, I would like to mention that I am running a sale over on my Etsy shop, and I will leave a link to that shop in the description. It is for 15% off your purchases of $20 or more, and I have originals listed, I have prints listed, and I have stickers listed. I also have an Inktober book available. I ended up taking all of the Inktober pieces I did, and I printed them into a book. There will also be a link to that in the description. So thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.